They say love is a language anyone can understand. But the real secret, the cruelest conversations are the ones you were never meant to overhear, especially when you understand every syllable. Last October, I sat in a candlelit restaurant in Milan while my wife, Caterina, described her affair in exquisite Italian to the man across from her. She smiled, she laughed, she painted our marriage as a prison, confident I was just the quiet American husband who only knew how to order Chianti. She was wrong. My name is David Callahan. I am 62 years old, a retired architect from a quiet Connecticut town, and for 40 years I have been married to a woman who never once suspected that the man she spoke over was listening to every syllable. Before I ever met Caterina, I spent 2 years in Naples as a Navy translator, and I came home with an ear for regional dialects that has never faded. She believes my Italian is limited to ordering wine. I let her. So when I sat in that candlelit restaurant and the man across from her leaned in and whispered, "Quando lo lasci?" When will you leave him? And she answered without a pause, I did not flinch. I set down my glass and I smiled because this was not a tragedy. This was an interrogation, and she had just answered the first question. Let me take you back to the beginning, because to understand the silence I kept that night, you need to understand the words I chose to bury. I was not born into language. I was born into noise. My grandfather Raphael spoke a Neapolitan dialect so thick that even other Italians squinted when he talked. He came through Ellis Island in 1938 with a cardboard suitcase and a vocabulary that could start a fight or broker a peace, depending on the inflection. I grew up in his kitchen in Waterbury, Connecticut, watching him gesture at the stove, and by the time I was 10, I understood that words were not decoration. They were inventory. At 18, I enlisted in the Navy. The recruiters saw a skinny kid with a working-class accent and thought I belonged in the engine room. Then I took the language aptitude test and placed in the 97th percentile. The Navy sent me to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, and from there they stationed me in Naples for 2 years as a translator of intercepted communications. I listened to voices for a living, voices that assumed no one on the other side understood. I learned to hear what people said when they believed they were invisible. After the Navy, I came home, studied architecture at Yale on the GI Bill, and built a quiet life designing libraries and municipal buildings. I never advertised the translator part of my past. I found that people behaved differently around you when they knew you could hear everything, so I stopped telling them. Then I met Caterina. She was at a gallery opening in New York in 1983, a visiting curator from Rome with dark hair pulled back in a tortoiseshell clip, and an opinion on every painting in the room. She spoke English with a musical accent, and when she learned my surname was Callahan, she asked if I had any Italian at all. I told her I knew enough to order wine. She laughed and said that was the only phrase a husband needed. 6 months later, we were married. From the beginning, her Italian was the wallpaper of our life together. She spoke it on the phone with her mother in Trastevere, laughed with her expat friends over espresso, muttered it under her breath when she was annoyed at traffic. And I listened, not to spy, but because I loved the sound of her unfiltered self. She was funnier in Italian, sharper, less guarded. I never corrected her assumption that I understood nothing. It seemed harmless, almost romantic, a secret door into my own wife's mind that I told myself I never needed to open. But here is the thing about a secret you hold for 40 years. It doesn't just sit there. It accumulates weight, and you learn to carry it so naturally that you forget you are carrying it at all. You are probably wondering what kind of man keeps his language hidden from his own wife for an entire marriage. I have asked myself the same question 1,000 times. The honest answer is not as dramatic as you might imagine. At first, it was convenience. Caterina spoke English beautifully, and our friends and family switched between languages so fluidly that my silence at the dinner table was just the quiet American husband. Then it became habit. Then it became something else, a permanent blind spot I maintained because I could see, because I was afraid that if she knew I understood everything, the music of her private voice would change its key. And so I let her believe I was linguistically helpless. She would translate for me in restaurants, patting my hand. She would whisper things to her sisters on the phone that she would never say to my face, small grievances about my habits, the way I left my shoes in the hallway, the way I never noticed when she changed her hair. Nothing sinister, until it became sinister. The shift was not a single event. It was a series of small adjustments in her behavior, Adjustments I catalogued the way an architect notices a crack in a foundation. She started holding her phone differently, tilting the screen away from me. She took longer in the mornings, standing in front of the closet, as if deciding not just what to wear but who to become. She bought a new perfume, something citrus and cold, not at all like the rosewater she had worn for decades. And when she spoke on the phone to her friend Annalisa, her voice would drop into a register I had never heard before, a register that meant the conversation was not for me. I began to listen more carefully. One evening she was in the kitchen and I was in the study, the door slightly ajar. She was speaking Italian rapidly, thinking I was upstairs. I caught fragments. Non posso aspettare di vederti. I cannot wait to see you. Marco, sei tutto per me. Marco, you are everything to me. I sat very still. The name Marco was unfamiliar. I knew her circle, her colleagues, her cousins. There was no Marco. That was the moment the habit of 40 years transformed into something else, something tactical. I did not confront her. I did not ask. I began to investigate, quietly, using skills I had not exercised since the Navy. I checked phone records, mapped the frequency of calls to a number in Milan. I discovered that her frequent art-buying trips were not entirely about art. The man was Marco Bianchi, a gallery owner with a reputation for acquiring more than paintings. Caterina had met him at a Biennale 2 years earlier, and since then they had built a parallel life, conducted almost entirely in the language she believed I could not penetrate. Every phone call, every message, every whispered endearment from my own kitchen had passed through the air directly into my ears, and she had no idea that I was collecting every syllable like evidence. It is an odd thing to love someone and simultaneously build a case against them, but I found that the two actions were not as contradictory as you might expect. Love is not blind, but it can be silent. And then she proposed the trip to Italy. It was supposed to be our anniversary, 40 years, a milestone. She suggested Milan for the art, and I said yes, because I wanted to see what she would do when she believed she was on her home ground. She mentioned that an old friend, an art dealer, would join us for dinner on the first night, just to save time on business. I told her that sounded splendid. I packed my best jacket and a small digital recorder I had purchased at a shop near Grand Central, no larger than a pen, and I smiled all the way to the airport. On the flight, she slept with her head against my shoulder, and I looked out at the Atlantic moonlight and thought about the language that had been my invisible partner in our marriage. Tomorrow evening, that language would step into the light and speak its final testimony. I did not know then how much that testimony would cost. The restaurant was called La Scala del Poeta, a jewel box of a place off the Via della Spiga with frescoed ceilings and waiters who moved like choreographed shadows. Caterina wore a red dress that I had never seen before, and her hand on my arm was light and rehearsed. Marco was already at the table, a man in his early 50s with gray at the temples and the kind of self-satisfaction that comes from being told he is handsome by people who expect nothing else in return. He stood and shook my hand, and Caterina said in English, "Marco, this is my husband David. He doesn't speak Italian, just the basics, so we will have to suffer my English." Marco smiled at me with all the warmth of a closing door. "We will manage," he said, and then almost before the bread basket landed on the table, they began. At first, they mixed languages, throwing me scraps of English politeness while the real conversation ran beneath like an undertow. But after the antipasto, the pretense fell away. They spoke entirely in Italian, the rapid, lyric Italian of two people who had been doing this for a very long time. I ate my risotto and nodded occasionally, smiling when their tone rose in a joke I was supposed not to find funny, and I listened. He described their last meeting in Rome, the hotel near the Piazza Navona. She ran her finger along the stem of her wine glass and said she had never felt so alive, so seen. He asked, "Quando lo lasci? When will you leave him?" And without a pause, without the slightest tremor in her voice, she answered, "Dopo l'anniversario, ha dei soldi nascosti di cui non so nulla. Quando fermo I documenti prendo tutto." After the anniversary, he has hidden money he knows nothing about. When I sign the papers, I take everything. I set down my fork. The metal clinked against the plate, a tiny sound in the expensive silence of the room. I looked at Caterina, at the face I had loved for 40 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was about to do. Then I opened my mouth and spoke Italian, not the broken Italian of a tourist fumbling through a phrasebook. The Italian of a man who had listened to intercepted communications in a naval station in Naples, who had decoded the exact meaning behind every regional inflection. The Italian of a man who had just heard his wife plan the theft of everything he owned. "Caterina," I said. Her head snapped toward me, and the color drained from her face in a single sheet of understanding. Marco's smile froze mid-sentence, a sculpture of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not ground at all. And I knew that everything that happened next would depend on the exact words I chose. I said her name, and the room contracted. Caterina's hand froze halfway to her wine glass, and Marco, middle-aged charmer with the easy confidence of a man who has never been caught, opened his mouth to fill the silence with something empty and discovered that no words came. The silence was complete. It was the silence of 40 years shattering all at once. I looked at my wife, and for the first time since we left the hotel, I let her see me fully, not the quiet American who smiled through family dinners and carried her bags and nodded when she translated restaurant menus, but the man who had spent every day of our marriage holding a key to a room she did not know existed. "Caterina," I said again, and this time my Italian was the Italian of a man who has listened to the rhythm of deception and knows exactly where to press. "Dimmi per favor questi soldi nascosti di cui parli, dove pensavi fossero? Tell me, please, these hidden funds you mentioned. Where did you think they were?" She did not answer. She could not answer because the ground she had stood on for 4 decades had just become a trapdoor, and no amount of composure can disguise the vertigo of free fall. Marco found his voice, a dry scrape of Italian that was suddenly deferential, suddenly uncertain. "Signor Callahan, I think there has been a misunderstanding. I think, Marco," I said, turning the full weight of my attention toward him, "that you have been sleeping with my wife and planning to finance your failing gallery with a retirement fund you believed I knew nothing about. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a conspiracy. And in this country, in this restaurant, right now, every word you have spoken is admissible evidence." I reached into my jacket and removed the small silver recorder, no larger than a pen, and placed it on the tablecloth next to the bread basket. The red light was still blinking. Marco's face lost all its architecture. "Thing about a secret marriage is not that it hides something from the world. It's that it hides the world from the secret, and when the barrier dissolves, everything floods in at once." I had been sitting on a fortune of quiet anger for 2 years, cataloging betrayals small and large, and what broke the dam was not the affair itself, but the casual, efficient cruelty of that single sentence, "Quando fermo I documenti prendo tutto." When I sign the papers, I take everything. That was not passion. That was a business plan. And I realized that the wife I had loved for 40 years had been auditing me the way a hostile investor audits a target, measuring the silence I gave her as weakness, mistaking my patience for ignorance. It was time to correct the record. Let me tell you about the hidden money, because it is central to everything that happened. Caterina believed I had an offshore account, a tidy sum accumulated from architectural commissions she thought I had underreported years ago. She had found a bank statement in my study last spring, a printed confirmation from a firm in Lugano, and she had said nothing, filing it away like a precious stone. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the document was planted. I left it on my desk intentionally. I wanted to see what she would do with the information. And she did exactly what I expected. She consulted Marco, and together they concocted a plan to wait until after the anniversary and then demand half my assets in a settlement, seizing the Lugano funds as her hidden leverage. But the account in Lugano was a fiction. It contained exactly €700, enough to maintain a minimum balance, and the rest of my wealth, a sum built over 40 years of quiet investments, real estate holdings in 3 states, and a modest stake in my late father's textile business that had grown into something substantial, was held in a trust she had no claim over. The trust was called the Callahan Language Institute, a small charitable foundation I established in 1998 to fund translation scholarships. Its board consisted of my attorney, my accountant, and a retired Navy translator I had served with in Naples. Caterina had never once asked me about it because she assumed it was a vanity project, and because I never spoke Italian. The irony of a language institute founded by a man who could not speak the language was simply part of my eccentric charm. The trust was ironclad, and the only person with the authority to dissolve it was me, and only upon my death. And I was very much alive. I let all of this sit in the air for a long moment while Marco stared at the recorder and Caterina's eyes filled with a slow-motion horror. Then I continued, my Italian still fluid, still precise, and I addressed her directly for the first time as the woman she had become, not the woman I had married. You believed I was a simple man, Caterina, a kind man, an architect who read American novels and watered the garden and never learned the language of your heart. You mistook my silence for emptiness, but I have been listening to you for 40 years. Every word you whispered in your mother's dialect, every secret you thought was yours alone, every bitter complaint about the man you married. I heard all of it, and I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I understood something you never did. Love is not the absence of secrets. It is the choice to keep some doors closed even when you have the key. She put her hand to her mouth. A gesture I had seen 1,000 times, surprise, grief, the sudden recognition of a truth too large to swallow. You could have spoken at any time, she said, her Italian now thin and fragile. All these years you let me think you didn't understand. I did, I said, because your voice in Italian was the only honest version of you I ever had. When you spoke English to me, you were translating yourself into a shape you thought I wanted. When you spoke Italian, you were real. I loved that version. I didn't want to lose it. The word loved hung between us, past tense, and I saw her flinch as if I had struck her. Marco shifted in his chair, and the movement brought me back to the present crisis. He was calculating, I could see it, the quick arithmetic of a man who has done wrong and is looking for the nearest exit. The recording, he said, you cannot use that. It is illegal. We did not consent. Actually, I said, Italian law permits the recording of conversations to which one is a party without the consent of other participants, as long as the recording party is physically present. I was here, you were here. The microphone is mine. The law is very clear. I paused, letting him absorb the walls closing in. But that is not the law that should concern you, Marco. The law that should concern you is Article 640 of the Italian Penal Code, fraud, and Article 110, conspiracy to commit fraud. You and my wife planned to deprive me of assets through deception. I have it on tape. The question is not whether I can use this recording. The question is whether I forward it to the Carabinieri tonight, or whether you sit back down and listen to the rest of what I have to say. The waiter appeared again, a young man with a single brave smile, asking if we needed anything. I ordered an espresso, then looked at Marco and Caterina and said, they will have water, nothing else. The waiter understood, as waiters in fine restaurants do, that he had walked into a private war, and he retreated with the grace of an ambassador recalled from a hostile country. Marco sat back down. Caterina had not moved. Her hands were clasped in her lap now, and the red dress that had seemed so confident an hour ago looked garish against the pallor of her skin. I let the silence stretch until the espresso arrived. I had learned from my grandfather Raphael that silence is a language of its own, and that the person who can hold it longest always controls the room. When the coffee was in front of me, black and bitter, I took a sip and began the next phase. Caterina, you mentioned signing papers after the anniversary. You were referring to divorce papers, I assume. A separation agreement filed in Connecticut, claiming irreconcilable differences, with a property division favoring you on the grounds of hidden assets you believed I had failed to disclose. You would present the Lugano statement and demand 80% of our joint holdings. Am I close? She did not answer, but her silence was confirmation. The problem, I continued, is that the joint holdings are not what you think. The house in New Haven, the apartment in Rome, the investment portfolio under both our names, those are real, but they amount to less than a quarter of our actual marital estate. The rest, the true foundation of my wealth, is held in structures you never knew existed because you never cared to ask about my work, my family, or the legacy my father left me. You assumed I was a salaried architect who retired with a modest pension, and I let you assume, because if I had shown you the full picture, you would have loved the picture, not the man. And I wanted to be loved as David, not as a balance sheet. Marco's face had turned the color of old parchment. He had thought he was seducing a wealthy man's wife. He had not counted on the wealthy man being significantly wealthier than anticipated and also fluent in the penal code. What do you want? Marco asked. It was the first honest question he had asked all evening. I want my wife to understand the cost of what she has done, I said. Not the financial cost, not the legal jeopardy, the human cost. The 40 years of trust she traded for hotel rooms and whispered phone calls. I want her to sit here across from me and explain to my face, in whatever language she chooses, why she believed I deserved to be robbed of my life's work. And then I want her to sign a document, not a divorce settlement, but a confession witnessed by my attorney, stating that she conspired to commit fraud. I will keep that confession in a safe deposit box. If she ever contests the true distribution of our assets or attempts to revise the story, the confession goes to the prosecutor. If she cooperates, she will leave this marriage with exactly what I agreed to give her when I believed she loved me: half of the marital home, a reasonable stipend, and no criminal record. And Marco, you will close your gallery in Milan, end all contact with my wife permanently, and donate the equivalent of my dinner tonight to a scholarship fund for translators. I will be checking. Katerina found her voice. It was raw, cracked open. David, I never meant. This wasn't about money. I was unhappy for a long time, and Marco made me feel alive. I finished for her. You said so earlier, I heard you, and I understand unhappiness, Katerina. I have been unhappy too, in ways you never noticed, because you were too busy speaking a language you thought I couldn't understand. But there is a difference between unhappiness and cruelty. You crossed that line when you made a plan to take what was not yours and leave me with nothing. That is not the act of a woman seeking happiness. That is the act of a predator, and I am not prey. She began to cry, silently, the tears cutting tracks through her makeup. I did not move to comfort her. I had spent 40 years comforting her, translating my own silence into patience, and the silence had run out. The restaurant around us had emptied slightly, the late diners finishing their panna cotta and calling for coats. The piano player in the corner had switched to something soft and melancholy, and the notes drifted through the tension like snow on a battlefield. I picked up the recorder and switched it off. Then I leaned forward and spoke in English for the first time since the confession. Katerina, the last 2 years, I have been planning this conversation. Not because I wanted vengeance, but because I knew that if the moment came when you tried to take everything, I needed to be calm enough to offer you a path back. That path is still here, but it closes at midnight tonight. After that, I call the attorney, and the version of me you see now, the patient man, disappears into a deposition. Do you understand? She nodded, a small broken motion. Marco did not nod. He simply stood, placed his napkin on the table, and walked out of La Scala del Poeta without looking back. I let him go. He was never the real adversary. The real adversary was sitting across from me in a red dress, and she had just realized that the language she thought was her weapon had always been my window, and that the window had just become a mirror, showing her exactly what she had chosen to become. The espresso was cold. The waiter brought the check, and I paid with a credit card that had no limit because the trust ensured that. Katerina watched me sign the receipt, and I saw her register the name on the card. It was a corporate card associated with the Callahan Language Institute. She had seen that card before in my wallet and never asked about it. Now she understood the scale of what she had underestimated. And as I rose from the table and offered her my arm out of habit, out of 40 years of habit, I knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether the rest of my life was spent alone or simply free, and that the difference between those two things was larger than any translation of the word. The exit from La Scala del Poeta was a slow walk through a room of strangers who sensed crisis and averted their eyes with the instinct of civilized people. I offered Katerina my arm from 40 years of habit, and she took it without speaking. Her hand on my sleeve was trembling, but I could not tell whether the tremor was shame or the cold night air that hit us as we stepped onto the Via della Spiga. We walked toward the Duomo in silence, past shuttered storefronts and late-night couples moving in the opposite direction, wrapped in each other and entirely unaware that the elderly pair passing them was a marriage at its terminal gate. Katerina stopped halfway across the piazza. David, she said in English now, because the Italian had been stripped from her like a revoked passport. What are you going to do? I looked at the cathedral, white and impossible against the night sky. I am going to protect myself. I am going to protect the foundation. And then I am going to let the law decide whether your actions were merely cruel or criminal. She flinched, and for a moment I saw the woman I had married beneath the woman who had sold me out for a hotel near the Piazza Navona. You said you would let me sign a confession, she whispered. I did. The offer stands, but you should know that the confession is only the start. There are things I haven't told you yet, things I discovered while you were busy planning what you thought was a perfect heist. I let the word heist fall between us, an American word in an Italian night, and I watched her face register that I had been several moves ahead for much longer than she could imagine. We returned to the hotel, the Principe di Savia, where our room had a view of a garden and a bed that had been turned down by staff who assumed we were celebrating an anniversary. I took off my jacket and sat in the armchair by the window. Katerina stood near the door, still in the red dress, like a guest waiting to be dismissed from a party she had ruined. "I need you to understand something," I said, and my voice was calm now, the calm of a man who has already done the hardest thing. "I didn't just record tonight. I have been recording for 18 months. Phone calls, voicemails, a digital trail that maps every promise you made to Marco about money you believed was hidden. The Lugano account was a test. You failed it, but it's worse than that." She gripped the back of a chair. "How could it be worse? Because Marco wasn't just your lover," I said. "He was your partner in a scheme that went far beyond taking my supposed offshore cash. 3 months ago, I hired an investigator in Milan. Marco Bianchi has done this before. He targets wealthy women, usually expatriates, isolates them, and convinces them to transfer assets into joint ventures. His gallery is a front. The real business is exploiting marital secrets, and you, Katerina, were his perfect mark. You handed him our financial details, my travel schedule, the names of my associates. He was going to clean you out after you cleaned me out." The expression on her face shifted from defensive fear to something more dangerous, recognition of a predator she had mistaken for a suitor. She sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "That's not true. Marco loves me." "Marco loves your access," I said. "He told me so himself, not tonight, but in a phone call I intercepted 3 weeks ago, which I have translated and timestamped. He called a business partner in Geneva and referred to you as La Mucca de Mungia, the cash cow. I'm sorry, Katerina. You threw away a marriage for a man who priced you by the kilo." She began to weep again, this time not the restrained tears of the restaurant, but the broken, gulping sobs of someone who has run out of lies and discovered the truth was uglier than any fiction. I let her cry. I did not hold her, but I didn't gloat either. I simply sat and waited, because the document I needed her to sign was more important than the theater of revenge. But then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the hotel room door, followed by a voice in Italian that was unmistakably official. "Polizia, aprite la porta," police. Opened the door. I rose, unlocked it, and admitted 2 plainclothes officers and a man in a grey suit who identified himself as an investigating magistrate. Behind them, in the corridor, I saw Marco, pale and sweating, flanked by a lawyer. He had gone not to escape, but to file a criminal complaint, claiming I had threatened him with a false recording and attempted extortion. The magistrate, a tired-looking man with the permanent scowl of someone who has seen every flavor of human deceit, asked if I was David Callahan. I confirmed. He informed me that I was being accused of criminal coercion under Article 317 of the Italian Penal Code. If proven, I could face up to 5 years in prison. Marco's lawyer added, with the greasy satisfaction of a man billing by the hour, that his client would drop the complaint only if I surrendered the recording and signed a statement admitting I had fabricated the content. It was the moment the entire game inverted. Marco had found the one crack in my armor. The Italian legal system moves slowly for victims, but very fast for accused foreign nationals. He didn't need to win. He only needed to delay, discredit, and drain. Katerina stood frozen, caught between the man who had betrayed her and the husband who had outplayed her. I felt a cold pressure in my chest, but not panic. I had been trained to decode chaos, and this was just another transmission. I asked the magistrate one question: if I can prove with independent evidence that the recording is authentic and that Signor Bianchi is engaged in ongoing fraud, will you accept it now? The magistrate frowned, nodded cautiously. I took my laptop from the safe, connected to the hotel's Wi-Fi, and accessed the encrypted cloud storage where my investigator had deposited reports for 18 months. On the screen, I pulled up Marco's phone records showing frequent calls to a known fraudster in Nice, a police report from a Parisian woman who had filed a complaint similar to Katerina's situation 2 years ago, and the transcript of the Geneva phone call where Marco discussed liquidating assets after the American husband was neutralized. The magistrate read quickly, his expression darkening. He turned to Marco's lawyer. "You filed a complaint against a victim who has already built a case against your client. This is not extortion. This is self-preservation with documentation." Marco began to stammer, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back. The police, whose impatience had shifted from me to the accuser, escorted Marco away for what the magistrate called a longer conversation downtown. My status as a criminal suspect evaporated, but the danger had not passed. Because while the police were in the room, Katerina had seen the screen. She saw the list of Marco's other victims, the word cow, the financial projections that treated her retirement as a line item. She saw that she had not been loved but catalogued, and the realization broke something final in her. When the door closed and we were alone again, she looked at me with the hollow eyes of a person who has been a passenger in her own destruction. David, I will sign anything you want. But I need to know one thing. If you knew everything for 2 years, why did you wait? Why did you let me humiliate myself tonight instead of stopping this months ago? That was the question I had been preparing for since the beginning. This was the pivot into the deeper truth, the truth that was not about an affair or a fraudulent art dealer, but about the architecture of my entire adult life. I stood at the window and looked down at the stone courtyard, the fountain still running in the dark. Because, I said, tonight was never about catching you, tonight was about freeing me. For 40 years, I built a life on the assumption that hiding myself was the price of keeping you. I thought if I showed you the man who understood, the man who controlled, the man who was truly rich, you would either leave or become someone I didn't recognize. But you did both anyway, without ever knowing the man. So I had to bring the whole structure to a single point of collapse. I had to sit at that table and hear you sell me out in the language you thought was your shield, because only then could I prove to myself that the marriage was dishonest from both ends, and that ending it was not cruelty, but necessity. I turned to face her. I waited because I needed to know whether the love I gave you in English was enough for the real you or only for the edited version. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. And now I know, and I can walk away without wondering if there was something I should have said earlier. I said it all tonight in Italian. The silence that followed was not angry. It was dry, like the air after a long rain. Katerina sat very still, absorbing the idea that her affair had been not the crime itself, but the key that unlocked a prison she had never known she was in. I opened the safe once more and took out 2 documents, a confession, as promised, and a preliminary divorce agreement that had been drafted weeks earlier by my attorney in Connecticut, waiting only for her signature. It granted her exactly half of the marital home in New Haven, a modest stipend, and no criminal record. It did not grant her the fortune she had planned to take, because that fortune had been quietly shifted into the Callahan Language Institute, an entity she had never bothered to understand. She signed the confession first, her hand moving as if the pen weighed 40 pounds. She signed the divorce agreement next. Then she looked up at me. What happens to me now? Now, I said, taking the documents and placing them in my leather portfolio. You go home to Connecticut if you wish, or you stay in Italy, whichever you choose. The marriage is over, but the legal war you were about to start is already finished, and you lost before you ever walked into the restaurant. I will not pursue the fraud charges, because the woman I married in 1983 deserves the dignity of not being prosecuted in the country of her birth. But you will never touch a dollar beyond what I've given you. And Marco Bianchi, who is now in the custody of the Carabinieri, will never touch you again. I walked toward the door. She called after me, her voice raw. Where are you going? To pay the hotel bill, I said, and to call my attorney to make sure Marco faces every charge he has earned. Then I'm going to find a quiet cafe and drink an espresso in a language I have never once forgotten. I'll be back in the morning to collect my things. Good night, Katerina. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door on 40 years of silence, and the click of the latch was the sound of a new kind of quiet, one that belonged entirely to me. But even as I walked to the elevator, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the president of the Callahan Language Institute board, my old Navy colleague Thomas. The message read, David, we have a situation. The quarterly filing with the IRS just flagged an anomaly with the donor rolls. Someone has been moving money into the foundation under a false name, a very large sum, and the timing suggests it's connected to the Italian gallery we've been tracking. You need to call me immediately. I stopped in front of the elevator, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Marco wasn't just a fraudster trying to steal from a marriage. He had already penetrated the one institution I had built to outlast my silence. The battle had just moved from the marital bed to the foundation of my entire legacy. And as the elevator doors slid open, I knew that this was the true war, the one I had never anticipated, and it was about to demand everything I had learned in 2 years of playing a quiet man. The elevator doors opened onto a basement level I had not intended to visit. I stepped back into the corridor, pressed my phone to my ear, and called Thomas. It was past midnight in Italy, early evening in Connecticut, and he answered on the second ring. "David, thank God, we have a serious problem." He told me the number, $470,000, wired in 3 installments from an account at a small private bank in Lugano, the same Lugano where I had planted my fake statement, and deposited into the Callahan Language Institute's operating fund under the name Fondazione Bianchi per l'Art, Bianchi Foundation for Art. Marco had not merely been trying to siphon money out, he had been injecting it in, quietly, through a donor-advised fund mechanism that would allow him to claim a tax deduction while positioning a shell entity to request a grant back to his gallery. It was a laundered circuit, and if the IRS flagged it before we did, the entire foundation could lose its charitable status. I had built a fortress, and Marco had been tunneling under the foundations for months. "Thomas, listen carefully. I need you to call our attorney in Hartford and file an emergency suspicious activity report with the IRS. Then contact the bank in Lugano and initiate a freeze on the originating account under Italian mutual legal assistance. I have the magistrate here. I'll handle the local end. Do not, under any circumstances, approve any grant requests until I call you back." Thomas, a man who had decoded Soviet naval signals in a windowless room for a decade, said simply, "Understood." The line went dead, and I walked not to the cafe but back toward the lobby, where I found the magistrate still packing his briefcase, preparing to follow his officers to the station. I stopped him with a single sentence, "Doctor, la fraude è grave più grande di quanto pensasimo." Doctor, the fraud is bigger than we thought. I showed him the text from Thomas, the alert, the evidence of an international financial crime that now crossed borders. He was tired, his eyes red-rimmed, but something sharpened in his face. This was no longer a domestic squabble with a recording. This was a structured fraud with a transnational footprint. He called his office and woke up a financial crimes prosecutor. Within the hour, I was sitting in a cold room at the Questura, recounting the history of my foundation, the planted Lugano statement, the recordings, and the discovery that Marco Bianchi had been layering his fraud into my charitable entity. The prosecutor, a brisk woman in her 50s named Dottoressa Ferri, asked if I had documentation. I handed over a thumb drive containing 18 months of investigator reports, bank statements, and the translated transcript of Marco's phone call calling my wife a cash cow. She read for 20 minutes and then looked up. "Signor Callahan, this man has been operating for years. There are at least 7 other victims we can now identify. The Fondazione Bianchi is a shell that has moved nearly €2 million through various cultural fronts. Your foundation was the latest and the most sophisticated because it allowed him to claim legitimacy through a real American charity. You just handed us the key to an entire network." I felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of an architect who has discovered the flaw in the enemy's structure and has just informed the demolition crew where to place the charges. Marco Bianchi would not be walking out of the Questura tonight. His gallery would be raided by morning, his Swiss accounts frozen, and his lawyer, who had so confidently threatened me with extortion charges, would soon be looking for new clients. The war was shifting from defensive to decisive. But there was still Katerina. I returned to the hotel at 3 in the morning, the lobby silent save for a single night clerk. I rode the elevator to our floor and found the room door ajar. Inside, the red dress lay draped over a chair and her suitcase was gone. On the pillow, a note in her handwriting, this time in Italian. "David, non ho mai saputo che fossi veramente, mai dispix di non averti mai chisto caeri nella tua lingua." David, I never knew who you really were. I'm sorry I never asked who you were in your own language. Below that, she had written a single English line. "I took the 5 a.m. train to Rome. I will not contest anything. Goodbye." I folded the note and put it in my jacket. The anger I had felt for 2 years did not vanish, but it quieted into something more durable, recognition that the marriage had been a long misunderstanding between two people who had both hidden themselves. She had hidden her greed and her loneliness. I had hidden my competence and my language. We were both frauds of a kind, and the exposure, while brutal, was also liberating. I slept for 4 hours, then woke, packed my own bag and checked out. The war in Italy was over. What followed in the weeks after Milan was a cascade of legal and financial closures. Marco Bianchi was formally charged with fraud, money laundering, and criminal association. The arrest made headlines in the Italian financial press, and the gallery on the Via della Spiga was shuttered. Caterina's confession, signed and witnessed, sat in a safe deposit box in New Haven, never to be used unless necessary. The divorce proceeded uncontested, and the marital home was sold, the proceeds split as agreed. She moved back to Rome and into her sister's apartment, and the last I heard, she was working part-time at a small museum, far from the circles that had introduced her to Marco. I did not wish her ill. I did not wish her anything at all. That was the most honest feeling I could locate. The Callahan Language Institute emerged stronger. The IRS accepted our suspicious activity report and recognized us as a victim, not a conspirator. The Lugano funds were seized by Swiss authorities and eventually returned to a pool of restitution for Marco's victims. The Foundation's scholarship program, which had been quietly funding translation studies for a generation, received a surge of new applications in the wake of the publicity, and Thomas and I spent a long afternoon in my New Haven office sorting through the candidates. It was then that I encountered the letter. It was in an envelope postmarked from a small town in Sicily, written in careful, almost formal English. The applicant was a young woman named Elissa, 22 years old, who wanted to study translation at the University of Bologna. Her field, she wrote, was legal and financial mediation, helping victims of international fraud understand the documents that had been used against them. Her mother had been one of Marco Bianchi's first victims, a widow who had lost her savings to his gallery scheme over a decade ago, and Elissa had been learning English specifically to read the contracts that had destroyed her family's security. She wrote, "I want to be the bridge my mother never had. I want to translate not just words, but power." The application was surrounded by glowing references and a transcript of perfect grades. I read her letter 3 times. I called Thomas. "We are funding this one in full." He didn't ask why, he heard it in my voice. The circle was closing in a shape I could never have predicted. Marco Bianchi, the man who had tried to hollow out my life, had unwittingly planted the seed for a young woman who would spend her career dismantling men like him, and my foundation would be the soil that grew her. That was not revenge. That was something cleaner, something that used the same language as justice without asking for applause. I flew back to Italy 6 months later, not for any legal proceeding, but to attend the Foundation's annual symposium in Bologna. Elissa was there, a slight figure with her mother's determined eyes. She greeted me in Italian and then, with a quick smile, switched to English to thank me. I replied in Italian and her eyes widened. "Lei parla Italiano, Signor Callahan?" I nodded. "Da 40 anni," I said, "for 40 years." I told her a condensed version of the story, the quiet husband who listened, the woman who never knew, the language that had become both wound and weapon. She listened with the stillness of someone who understood the weight of unsaid things. "You kept it silent for so long," she said. "Are you speaking now?" "Only to the people who deserve to hear," I answered. That evening, I walked the porticos of Bologna alone, the light gold and slanted, and I thought about the long arc of my life. I had been a translator before I was anything else, a man who moved meaning from one mind to another. Then I became an architect, a builder of forms that held people and their secrets. Then a husband, a keeper of a silence so vast it had its own architecture. Now I was something else, a steward of a foundation that was no longer about hiding, but about opening doors. The Italian I had hoarded for decades was finally in the open, and it felt like exhaling. My grandfather Raphael used to say that language is not a set of words, but a record of what a family chooses to remember. He spoke Neapolitan to recall the cliffs of his childhood. He spoke English to survive. He spoke to me in a mixture that was its own private tongue. I had suppressed that inheritance out of fear that my wife would not love the man who understood too much. But the fear was misplaced. The real danger was never understanding. The real danger was understanding and doing nothing with it. Acting on what I heard in that Milan restaurant had been the first step. Building a foundation that armed others with the same skill was the second. Meeting a young woman who would turn that skill against the predators of the world was the third. And some days, when the office is quiet and the Connecticut winter settles in, I still hear my wife's voice in Italian, planning the theft of my life, and I do not flinch. I let it play, not as a wound, but as a reminder that silence is a choice and speech is a responsibility. The quiet man in the flannel shirt was never weaponless. He was simply waiting for the precise moment when language would become action. That moment, 40 years in the making, had arrived. And now every scholarship we grant, every document Elissa translates, every hour I spend teaching my grandson the Neapolitan words my grandfather taught me, is a continuation of that action, spoken aloud and without apology. There is a particular loneliness that comes with being the only person in a room who understands both languages being spoken. You are present but invisible, a ghost at your own table. For 40 years, I thought that loneliness was the price of keeping my marriage whole. I was wrong. The loneliness was not the price of love. It was the symptom of a deeper choice, the choice to hide competence in the hope of being loved for what I was not. The night in Milan stripped that choice away, and in the stripping, I found something I had forgotten I possessed. A voice that had been waiting, fully formed, for decades to be used. I tell you this story not because it is extraordinary, but because its architecture is ordinary. Every one of us holds a language that someone else does not know we speak. It may not be Italian. It may be the language of patience, the language of financial clarity, the language of hidden strength we keep muted to avoid disrupting a fragile peace. The question is not whether we keep that language silent. It is whether we have chosen the silence deliberately or whether it has chosen us by default. My silence was deliberate, but it had outlived its purpose. The dinner in Milan was its funeral and my liberation. I am 62 years old, and I have started speaking Italian again, openly, in restaurants and on the phone, and to my grandson, who laughs when I roll my R's. Elissa is completing her first semester in Bologna, and last week she sent me a photograph of her mother holding a restitution check from the Swiss authorities. The amount was not enormous, but the dignity was. Marco Bianchi will not see the outside of a prison until he is an old man. And Caterina. I occasionally receive a postcard from Rome, always brief, never asking for anything. I do not reply, but I do not discard them either. They sit in a drawer in my study, a small archive of a life that was and is no longer. If there is anything I want you to take from this, it is that the languages you keep hidden are not weaknesses to be guarded, but tools to be wielded at the right moment. Not for revenge, but for truth. Not for humiliation, but for justice. The quiet man at the dinner table is never as quiet as he seems, and the moment he chooses to speak in a tongue no one expected is the moment the entire room rearranges around him. That power is available to anyone who has learned to listen before speaking. I learned it in a naval station in Naples, and I used it in a candlelit restaurant in Milan, and I now spend it every day through a foundation that teaches others to hear what the world tries to keep silent. I'm David Callahan, and that is my story. If you believe that the quietest voices deserve the loudest platforms, subscribe to this channel. Tell us in the comments, what language are you holding back, and what would it take for you to speak it aloud? We read every one, and thank you truly for listening. The silence was long, but the conversation has just begun.